The train from Paddington arrived at Thistlewick Halt 40 minutes late, which gave Miss Marple ample time to observe the station and find it instructive. It was the kind of halt that had once believed in itself. A small waiting room with a fireplace that had not been lit this season, a platform clock that showed the correct time with the slightly aggressive accuracy of a clock that has nothing else to offer, and the single porter who moved her bag from the carriage to the platform did so with the economy of a man who has learned that most of what arrives here leaves again within a week. Gwen Ashcroft was waiting at the gate in a brown wool coat, and an expression of relief that she was trying to moderate into something more appropriate to a bereavement. "Jane," she said, and then immediately, "I'm so glad you've come. I wasn't certain you would." "You wrote as though something was wrong," Miss Marple said, taking her arm. "And you are not usually a woman who writes like that." Gwen had been her niece's school friend, and then her niece's neighbor, and then, after the niece moved away, a correspondent who had kept up with an assiduousness that suggested she valued the connection for its own sake, rather than as a social duty. She was 55 and efficient and observant, in the way of women who have lived in small places long enough to develop the habit without quite admitting to it. She had written 4 days ago. "Something is not right about Edith Brentwood's death. I cannot say more precisely than that, and I am half afraid I am imagining things, but I cannot stop thinking about it, and I would feel much better if you were here." Miss Marple had packed her bag the following morning. The village of Thistlewick was a 15-minute walk from the halt, along a lane that had been cut into the hill some centuries ago and had been slowly reasserting itself ever since. The hedgerows on either side had gone to their October bones, a tracery of dark twig and the occasional wren-sized flicker of movement, and the sky above was the color of old pewter, low and serious. It would rain before evening. Miss Marple noted this with the equanimity of a woman who has always packed sensibly. "Tell me about Mrs. Brentwood," she said as they walked. Gwen told her. Edith Brentwood, 78, widow of the late Colonel Brentwood, who had died of a cardiac episode 11 years ago, had lived at Crest Hollow for the whole of her married life, and had not considered living anywhere else for the whole of her widowhood. She had been, Gwen said carefully, a presence, not popular in the way of people who make themselves easy, popular in the way of people whose approval is rationed and therefore valued. She had been ill for 3 years, Gwen said, not dramatically ill, nothing anyone could point to and say that is the thing that is killing her. A general fading, Doctor. Price called it cardiac weakness combined with age, and a disposition not to recover from things. She had 2 sons, Lawrence, who lives at Crest Hollow and has always run the estate, and Neville, who lives in Bristol and visits on occasions. And she had Miss Jevons Clara, who has been her companion for 20 years, and who I think loved her more truly than either of the boys did. She died 5 days ago, in the night, in her sleep. Clara found her in the morning. Gwen paused. Dr. Price signed the certificate without requesting a post-mortem. There was no reason not to. She had been ill. It was the kind of death one had been expecting. "And yet," Miss Marple said, "and yet—" Gwen pulled her coat closer. "I saw someone leaving Crest Hollow that night. Late, nearly midnight. I was up with a headache, and I looked out of my bedroom window, which faces the lane, and I saw a figure in a dark coat coming through the side gate and walking away toward the village. I assumed it was Lawrence. He and Dorotha, his wife, live in the east wing. They have their own entrance at the side. I thought perhaps he had been called out, except that he wasn't called out that I can discover. And when I mentioned it the next morning, Lawrence said he had been in bed before 11 and slept straight through." Miss Marple considered this. "You believed him?" Gwen was quiet for a moment. I believed that he believed I would believe him, she said finally, which is not the same thing. But I may have been wrong about it being Lawrence at all. It was dark, and I only saw them for a moment. They had come to the top of the lane, where the hedgerow gave way to a low stone wall, and the village proper began, a cluster of rooftops around the square tower of St. Bartholomew's, a row of attached cottages on the far side, and set apart on slightly higher ground at the far end of the village, the grey stone face of Crest Hollow. It was a house that had once been confident, and was now performing confidence, which is a different thing. The proportions were handsome. Georgian, 4 windows wide on each floor, a doorway with a good fanlight. But the stone had not been cleaned in some time, and the elm trees on either side of the drive had grown tall enough to shadow the upper windows even in October. There were crows in those elms. As Miss Marple stood looking up at the house, she counted 9 of them, black and still among the stripped branches. "The crows have been there since the morning of the death," Gwen said, following her gaze. "Probably a coincidence, very probably," Miss Marple agreed. Then she noticed that the elm nearest the side gate, the gate Gwen's figure had come through 5 nights ago, was entirely empty. 1 tree disturbed, 8 undisturbed. Not wind, then. Something more regular than wind. "I think," she said pleasantly, "that I should like to call on the family tomorrow morning, if they will receive me." "They will?" Gwen said. "The village is calling. It would look odd not to." Miss Marple looked at the empty elm a moment longer. Someone had been coming and going through that gate with enough regularity that the birds had learned the habit of it. "Good," she said. "I find that condolence calls are often the most informative kind." She turned from the gate and allowed Gwen to lead her toward the cottage, while above Crest Hollow the 9 remaining crows sat in their 8 trees and did not move at all. Crest Hollow received visitors in the drawing-room, which was on the ground floor to the left of the entrance hall, and which had been arranged at some point in the past to suggest a prosperity that the rest of the house no longer quite supported. The curtains were good, heavy damask in a dark green that had faded to something more interesting than its original color, but the sofa beneath the window had been turned slightly to conceal a worn patch on the arm, and the fire, though lit, had been built with the economy of people who are watching what things cost. Miss Marple noted these details with the attention she gave to all domestic arrangements, which was the same attention a doctor gives to a patient's color. Not dramatic, not conclusive, but rarely without meaning. Lawrence Brentwood met them in the hall. He was 51 and looked like a man who had been 51 for some years. Not aged beyond his time, but settled into it with the permanence of someone who has stopped expecting things to change. He was tall, well-made, with the kind of face that would have been called distinguished in another decade, and was now simply composed. He shook Miss Marple's hand with the correct warmth of a man receiving a condolence call from his mother's acquaintance, and he said all the right things about being grateful for the visit, and his mother having spoken warmly of Miss Marple, which was almost certainly not true, but was the sort of thing one said. It was his eyes that interested her, not their expression, which was sorrow appropriately measured, but their quality. They were the eyes of a man who was tired in the way that sleep does not address. Clara Jevons had been right about that, though she had not known quite what she was describing. "My wife is resting," Lawrence said, leading them through to the drawing-room. "She has not been sleeping well. I'll ask Mrs. Henning to bring tea." "Please don't go to any trouble on my account," Miss Marple said. "It's no trouble." He said it with a slight emphasis, as though the capacity to produce tea without trouble was one of the few things still reliably within his control. Clara Javins was already in the drawing-room, sitting in a low chair near the fire with a piece of mending in her lap that she was not mending. She was 62, small and fine-boned, with the particular quality of a woman who has spent 20 years being professionally unobtrusive and has become genuinely difficult to see in a room even when she is the first person in it. She stood when they entered. "Miss Marple," she said, "Gwen told me you were coming. I'm glad." She said it simply, without social decoration, which Miss Marple found more informative than any elaboration would have been. They sat. Tea arrived, brought by a stout woman named Mrs. Henning, who had the expression of someone in the early stage of transferring their loyalties from the dead to the living, and had not yet decided where they would land. Miss Marple accepted a cup and a small shortbread biscuit, and looked about the room with the alert placidity of a woman doing nothing in particular. "It must be a great comfort," she said, to both of them generally, "to have had so much time to prepare. 3 years is a long illness." "It is and it isn't," Clara said. "You prepare for the shape of it, the absence of her at breakfast, the quiet upstairs. But the day itself is always a surprise. I don't know why that should be true, but it is." Lawrence had taken up a position near the mantelpiece with his tea, which is where men in drawing-rooms often go when they are not sure whether they wish to be part of a conversation. "She was not in pain at the end," he said. "That was the important thing." "Dr. Price was very attentive," Miss Marple offered. "He was." A slight pause. "He has been the family's doctor for 15 years. He knew her well. There was nothing wrong with any of this. It was the conversation of bereavement, conducted correctly." And Miss Marple was aware that she was being offered its correct surface and nothing beneath it. She accepted this without disappointment. The surface of things, examined carefully enough, was nearly always sufficient. "She must have been glad to have you close," she said to Lawrence. "To have the house running properly around her. It can't have been easy, managing everything. One does what's needed." He said it without self-pity, and without pride either. It was the statement of a man describing a fact that no longer seemed to require an emotional register. "The estate keeps you busy, I imagine. Crest Hollow has always been a serious undertaking." Something moved in Lawrence's face. Not alarm, not guilt, but a very brief and very controlled adjustment, like a man shifting his weight before a picture he does not wish to be pressed on. "We manage," he said. Miss Marple turned back to Clara, who was watching Lawrence with an expression of habituated concern. The look of a woman who has been worrying about someone for long enough that the worry has become a feature of her face in his presence. "And you," Miss Marple said gently. "You were with her at the end?" "Not at the very end. I brought her milk at 9:30. She always had warm milk before sleeping, and she was comfortable. A little sleepy. I sat with her for perhaps 20 minutes. And then she told me to go to bed, which she had been saying to me for 20 years, and so I went." Clara's hands had stilled entirely in her lap. "Lawrence took the milk up, actually. He came along the corridor as I was going and said he'd carry it. He always did that." She said this with the warmth of a reported kindness, something she had long catalogued among the things Lawrence had done right. She was gone by morning. "It was very peaceful," Lawrence said from the mantelpiece, "exactly as Dr. Price expected." Miss Marple nodded with the gentle acceptance of a woman whose world was full of peaceful deaths and who found each one a distinct and specific thing. She set down her teacup and asked, with the careful irrelevance of a woman whose conversation tended to wander, whether Crest Hollow still kept horses. She had noticed the stable block from the lane, and it appeared to be in good order. "Two," Lawrence said. He seemed, if anything, slightly relieved by the change of subject. "A mare and a gelding. We've cut back from 6 years ago, but I've always kept 2. I prefer the place to have something living in it." "They must be company," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "In the winter especially." "They've been particularly well settled this year," Lawrence said. "No trouble at all." "How very fortunate!" She smiled, and the smile was entirely warm, and she filed the information away in the place she kept such things, next to the quality of his tiredness and the slight pressure in his voice when he said "we manage," and the fact that it was always Lawrence who carried the milk. As they were leaving, Miss Marple paused in the entrance hall beneath a row of framed family photographs. They were arranged chronologically, the oldest nearest the door. The colonel in uniform, a young Edith with the alert expression of a woman who intended to be reckoned with, and the most recent at the far end. The most recent showed Edith in this very room, seated in the chair Clara had occupied today. It had been turned on its hook very slightly, so that Edith's face was angled away from the window. Miss Marple straightened it very gently and turned it to face the room. No one was watching. She went out into the cold October air and took Gwen's arm, and they walked back along the lane toward the village, and she did not speak for some time, which Gwen had the sense to understand as something other than silence. Gwen's cottage had a small spare room that smelled of lavender and sensible decisions, and Miss Marple slept in it with the soundness of a woman whose conscience was clear, and whose mind, when it had finished its nightly sorting, was content to rest. She was up at 6:30. By 7 she had made tea, examined the garden through the kitchen window, with the appraising eye of a woman who gardens seriously, and established that the elm nearest the Crest Hollow side gate was again undisturbed. Whoever had been using it with such regularity had stopped, which was itself a kind of information. Gwen came down at 7:30 and found the tea already made and Miss Marple at the kitchen table with a small notebook which she closed without hurry. "You slept?" Gwen asked. "Very well. Your spare room is excellent. The mattress has been turned recently. Last month. I had my sister visiting." Gwen sat down and accepted a cup. "Are you going to tell me what you're thinking?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I am thinking several things simultaneously, and they have not yet arranged themselves into any particular order. I find it is better not to speak too early. One ends up committed to ideas that the facts have not yet earned." Gwen, who had known Miss Marple for 23 years, accepted this without protest and went to make toast. The occasion for returning to Crest Hollow that morning presented itself without any engineering on Miss Marple's part, which she took as a small confirmation that the world was occasionally cooperative. Gwen had promised to return a book, a trollop, borrowed by Edith 3 months ago and never read, which had been sitting on Gwen's shelf, acquiring the mild guilt of all borrowed and unreturned things, and this provided a pretext that required no elaboration. They found the front door opened by Mrs. Henning, who informed them that Mr. Lawrence was out on the grounds, and Mrs. Brentwood was resting, but that Mr. Neville was in the library and would certainly be glad of the company. The library at Crest Hollow was at the back of the house, looking out over what had once been a formal garden, and was now a garden with formal ambitions and insufficient staff. It was a good room, high-ceilinged, well-proportioned, with the particular smell of books that have not been moved in some time, and it was being occupied by Neville Brentwood, in the manner of a man who is looking for something he does not wish to appear to be looking for. He was 44, and had the quality, which Miss Marple had encountered before in younger sons, of a man whose grievances had been carefully maintained over many years, until they had achieved the density and permanence of furniture. He was not unpleasant. He had a sharp, mobile face and a quick intelligence, but there was about him the slightly too present quality of someone who has arrived with an agenda he has not yet decided whether to disclose. He was standing at the estate desk when they came in, a ledger open in front of him, and he closed it with the unhurried deliberateness of a man, demonstrating that he has nothing to hide by the very carefulness with which he hides it. "Miss Marple," he said when Gwen made the introduction. "You were a friend of my mother's? An acquaintance through Gwen. I wanted to pay my respects to the house." She looked about the room with every appearance of innocent admiration. "What a very fine library! Has it always been arranged this way?" "Since my grandfather's time, I think." He glanced back at the desk, then away from it, with the manner of a man trying to decide whether to confide. He was, Miss Marple sensed, in the specific condition of someone who has recently discovered something alarming and does not yet know who can be trusted with it. This was a useful condition in a witness. It made people speak slightly past their intentions. "You've come up from Bristol," she said. "It's good of you to make the journey." "I came 3 weeks ago, actually, before she died." He moved away from the desk and dropped into one of the leather chairs with the ease of a man reclaiming childhood territory. I had word that it might be time." "From the family?" A slight hesitation. "Not exactly." Miss Marple waited. She had found, over a long life, that silences in conversation were frequently more productive than questions, provided one waited through them with sufficient patience and an expression of benign inattention. "An anonymous letter," Neville said, with the air of a man who has been wanting to say this for several days. "Posted locally, though I can't identify the hand. It said only that if I wished to be present at the end of certain matters pertaining to the estate, I should come soon." He looked at her with the slightly defensive alertness of a man who expects to be told he is being dramatic. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like someone wanted you here," Miss Marple said, "which is interesting. Did you bring the letter?" "I have it upstairs. I haven't shown it to the police. There are no police officially. And I haven't shown it to Lawrence, for obvious reasons." "Quite obvious," she agreed. "And since you've arrived, have you found the matters pertaining to the estate that the letter referred to?" He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved back to the closed ledger on the desk. "I've been looking," he said. "The bookkeeping is, Lawrence has his own notation system, which he has used for 30 years and which requires either his explanation or considerable time to decode. But there are entries in the farm account that I can't reconcile. Purchases attributed to livestock management that I can't match to any livestock event I can identify." He stopped himself. "I may be wrong. I am not an accountant." "No," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "But you are a younger son, which means you have been paying close attention to the estate accounts for a great deal longer than any accountant has." She said it without any sting, as a simple observation, and Neville looked at her with the slightly startled expression of a man who has been accurately described. Dr. Price arrived at 11. "A condolence call," Mrs. Henning announced, though he had already made one the day before, which was perhaps one more than strictly required. He was 58, a compact and careful man with the permanently considering expression of a GP who has learned that most presenting complaints are not about what they appear to be about. He shook hands with Miss Marple and said that Gwen had mentioned she was visiting, and that he hoped she was finding Thistlewick comfortable, and Miss Marple said she found it very interesting, which he took to mean pleasant. "You were Mrs. Brentwood's physician for 15 years, she said, as they stood together near the window while Gwen and Neville discussed the funeral arrangements with Mrs. Henning in the doorway. "That must be a particular kind of loss." "It is," he said. He was looking out at the garden with the slightly fixed quality of a man keeping his expression in order. "She was not an easy patient. She had strong views about what constituted necessary information and what constituted fussing, and the two categories were not always where a doctor would place them. But she was very clear-minded, until nearly the end. "You have been going back over your notes, I imagine." He looked at her then, with a quality she could only describe as recognition, the look of a man who has been thinking something privately and has just found that it is not as private as he believed. "It is the professional habit," he said carefully. "After a death, one reviews." "Of course," she smiled. "And have your notes been illuminating?" There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds, which was approximately 3 seconds longer than the question required if the answer were simply no. "I have found 1 or 2 entries that I wish I had followed up on at the time," he said. "Nothing conclusive. Simply entries that I would now read with a different emphasis." Miss Marple nodded with the gentle sympathy of a woman receiving information that did not surprise her. "How conscientious of you to go back," she said. "Most people find it easier not to." On their walk home, passing the bottom of Crest Hollow's drive, Miss Marple paused at the wall and looked up at the house with the air of a woman doing nothing more than catching her breath. "Those horses," she said to Gwen. "Has Crest Hollow always kept horses?" "Since before I moved here, though they've been reduced over the years. There used to be 6, apparently, now only 2, and they are kept where?" "The stable block I can see from here." "Yes, east of the house, behind the kitchen garden." Miss Marple looked at the stable block for a moment with what appeared to be the appreciative gaze of a woman who is fond of horses. Then she looked at the side gate, the empty elm above it, and then at the path between the gate and the stable block, which was direct and well-worn. "How long has it been well settled?" she said, apparently to herself. "I'm sorry, nothing." She took Gwen's arm. "I was thinking about something," Mr. Lawrence said. "I should like to speak to Dr. Price again, not today, but soon. And I believe tomorrow I will pay a call on Mrs. Tulse at the post office. Agnes Tulse will tell you everything she knows and several things she doesn't." "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely what I am counting on." The post office in Thistlewick occupied the ground floor of a double-fronted cottage on the north side of the square, and it had been run by Agnes Tulse for 31 years, with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that information, properly managed, was a form of civic service. The postal counter was at the back, behind a rack of birthday cards and a revolving stand of local interest booklets that had not been restocked since approximately 1947. The front portion served as a general shop. Tinned goods, writing materials, a small selection of seasonal confectionery. And it was here that Agnes conducted the majority of her real business, which was the collection and careful redistribution of village knowledge. She was 70, with white hair cut practically, and eyes of a particular pale gray that had the quality of good window glass, apparently transparent, but capturing everything that passed through them. Miss Marple arrived at 10:30, which she had calculated was late enough to avoid the morning post-rush, and early enough to precede the lunchtime errands. She selected 3 first-class stamps, a box of notelets with a sprig of holly on the front, somewhat premature for October, but the selection was limited, and positioned herself at the counter with the air of a woman with time to spend. "You'll be Miss Marple," Agnes said, applying the stamps with the authority of a woman who knows which glue is reliable. "Gwen Ashcroft's visitor. We heard you'd arrived." "I arrived yesterday. I always think October is an underestimated month for travel." "It has its qualities," Agnes agreed, in the tone of a woman who has not traveled since 1962 and does not feel the lack. "Terrible business at Crest Hollow, though not unexpected, I suppose." "Not unexpected at all," Miss Marple said. "She had been ill for some time, and yet one is never quite prepared." Clara Jevons will feel it most." Agnes began straightening a stack of envelopes that did not need straightening. 20 years is a long time to be in one person's orbit. You forget, after a while, how to navigate without them. I said as much to my sister when she lost her husband. Not that it's the same thing, but there are similarities. I imagine Clara was Mrs. Brentwood's primary correspondent as well, Miss Marple said, handling letters and so forth. She was Mrs. Brentwood was very particular about her correspondence. Never telephoned if she could write, which I always respected. We had a standing arrangement, practically. Clara would come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, regular as weather, though she's not been in this week, which is understandable. Miss Marple selected a booklet from the local interest stand, Thistlewick, a brief history, 16 pages, 3 photographs, and set it on the counter. "Has anyone else from the family been in recently? I imagine there are a great many administrative letters to send after a death, solicitors and so forth." Agnes considered this with the careful expression of a woman measuring what portion of her knowledge was appropriate to the occasion. "The solicitor sent a telegram, actually, 2 weeks before Mrs. Brentwood died, which I thought was on the formal side, and Mr. Neville came in the day he arrived, about 3 weeks ago, to notify a change of address for his post. He was up from Bristol in rather a hurry, I thought. He didn't have his usual luggage. Just an overnight bag. He came quickly then. Something must have prompted him." Agnes's expression shifted very slightly. The adjustment of a woman deciding that this particular piece of information was in the public interest. "There was a letter," she said, "posted locally, which I noticed because Mr. Neville is Bristol correspondence generally. Typewritten envelope, or rather hand-printed, very carefully, the kind of printing that doesn't want to be recognized as handwriting. I can't tell you the contents, naturally. But it arrived 10 days before he did, which fits." Miss Marple made a small sound of interested acknowledgement and opened her purse for the booklet. "And Mrs. Brentwood's family, her sons, were they regular correspondents themselves, or did they tend to manage things by telephone? Mr. Lawrence rarely writes letters, a practical man. Mr. Neville used to write to his mother quarterly. I could set my calendar by it, though that had fallen off in the past year or so."
Agnes accepted the coins for the booklet.
"Mrs. Brentwood wrote to her solicitor regularly. And Clara, of course. And there was a period, 18 months ago, when Mrs. Brentwood was sending rather more letters than usual. 3 in a fortnight once, which was notable, to the solicitor, and to one other address in London that I didn't recognize. Not a business address, residential, I thought, though one can't always tell." She paused. She seemed around that time to have something on her mind. She came in herself once, which she hadn't done in 2 years. Walking with a stick, very determined, asked me to weigh a package personally and make certain it was sent recorded delivery. I asked if she was well, and she said she was perfectly well, and that she was simply being careful. Miss Marple absorbed this. Edith Brentwood, a woman not given to unnecessary exertion, walking to the post office herself, in poor health, to ensure a package was sent correctly. 18 months ago. Whatever she had decided to do, she had decided to do it properly. And the Brentwood household, do they use you for supplies at all? Agricultural materials, that sort of thing? Agnes reached below the counter for a small catalogue. A general agricultural and household supplier, the kind of thick-page document that had served rural households for 100 years. We process orders for a few of the larger households. Crest Hollow has an account. She opened it with the ease of long familiarity, though they don't use it for everything, Mr. Lawrence has his own trade accounts with the farm suppliers. Of course, though for smaller items, pharmaceuticals, that sort of thing, People do tend to go through general suppliers when they'd rather not trouble the chemist." Agnes was quiet for a moment. She was not a stupid woman, and she was now performing the private calculation of a woman who has held a piece of information for some weeks and is assessing whether the correct moment for its release has arrived. "Mrs. Brentwood's daughter-in-law," she said at last, with the care of someone placing a very specific object on a very specific surface. "Mrs. Dorothea Brentwood. She placed an order through here approximately 8 weeks ago. A pharmaceutical supplier, not our usual one, a specialist catalog, for a sedative compound. She said it was for a personal matter and asked me to be discreet." Agnes looked at Miss Marple steadily. "I have been discreet. I am being discreet now." "Quite so," Miss Marple said warmly. "A veterinary compound, perhaps? They use them in that household. They keep horses." Agnes's expression shifted with the small, almost imperceptible movement of a woman recalibrating. "I don't know the specific compound. I could look at the order record for administrative purposes." She disappeared through a door behind the counter and returned after 90 seconds with a small carbon copy ledger. She placed it open on the counter and positioned it so that Miss Marple could read the relevant entry without quite handing it to her, which preserved the distinction between showing and telling. Miss Marple read the entry. The compound was not, as it happened, a veterinary sedative. It was a pharmaceutical-grade sleep compound available without prescription through specialist catalogs, used in clinical settings for adjunct sedation. It was not a product a woman would typically order through a rural post office unless she were either very discreet or very uninformed about the alternatives. Dorothea Brentwood, Miss Marple thought, was not uninformed about the alternatives. She was very discreet. The question was what, precisely, she was being discreet about. "Thank you so much," she said, gathering her stamps and her booklet and her notelets with the pleasant unhurry of a woman whose morning had been everything she had hoped. "I find Thistlewick very well supplied. One always worries, in a small village, about getting the things one needs. But you seem to have thought of everything." Agnes Tulse accepted this with the dignity of long professional pride. "We try," she said. "There isn't much that passes through this village that we can't accommodate." Miss Marple believed her entirely. She stepped out into the pale October square, turned up her collar against a wind that had developed an opinion since morning, and stood for a moment with the brief history of Thistlewick under her arm, looking at the church tower and thinking about a woman who had walked, in poor health, to post a package personally, and about a daughter-in-law who had ordered a sedative compound through a channel that was discreet but not untraceable, and about the specific difference between a person who is administering something and a person who is investigating something, which was a distinction that would matter very much before this week was out. She walked back toward Gwen's cottage at the steady pace of a woman with nowhere to be and a great deal to think about. The rose beds at Crest Hollow ran along the south-facing wall of the kitchen garden in a long, well-considered row that had been planted by someone with genuine knowledge and maintained, in recent years, by someone with genuine commitment but insufficient time. The bushes were healthy but slightly overcrowded, the kind of roses that would benefit from a hard cutting back in spring and had instead received a conscientious but insufficient tidying each autumn. Miss Marple, who had opinions about roses, observed this with the mild sympathy one extends to a good garden in difficult circumstances. Dorothea Brentwood was at the far end of the row with a pair of secateurs, working through the deadheads with the focused intensity of a woman who has found, in a specific physical task, the only available form of relief from a specific mental one. She was wearing a long dock coat, charcoal wool, well cut, the kind of coat that had been expensive 8 years ago and was now simply good. And she moved along the row with the economical precision of someone who has done this particular task many times and does not need to think about it. She heard Miss Marple's approach on the gravel path and turned with the controlled expression of a woman who has been managing her face in company for some weeks. "Miss Marple, not unwelcoming but assessing. Gwen said you might call again. I'm afraid Lawrence is out on the grounds and won't be back until luncheon." "I came to see you, actually," Miss Marple said with the simplicity of a woman who finds directness the kindest approach. "If you can spare a few minutes. I won't keep you from your roses. They're in good hands, I can see." Dorothea looked at the secateurs and then set them on the wall with the air of a woman releasing something she had been holding rather tightly. "They need doing," she said. "If you leave the deadheads past October, they set the wrong habit for spring." She paused. "Lawrence doesn't see the point of it. He says you should let the garden manage itself." "Gardens that manage themselves," Miss Marple said, "tend to manage themselves into something one didn't intend." Dorothea looked at her with a brief, sharp attention, the look of a woman who has heard a remark that could be taken several ways and is deciding which way it was meant. Then she moved along the wall and sat on the stone bench at the end of the row, pulling her coat around her against the cold. Miss Marple sat beside her. For a moment neither of them spoke. The kitchen garden had the particular quiet of an enclosed space in autumn, the sound of the wind reduced to a suggestion above the wall, the distant rooks from somewhere past the stable block, the smell of cold earth, and the faint sweetness of the last roses, which were a deep apricot, and had no business being as good as they were this late in October. "You've been in Thistlewick before?" Dorothea asked. "No. Gwen has been trying to get me here for years. I'm sorry it took a death to accomplish it." Miss Marple smoothed her gloves. "You must be very tired." Dorothea looked at the rose bed. "I don't sleep particularly well. No, I imagine not." A pause. "It's a great deal to carry, isn't it? A household in bereavement and all the arrangements and the family gathered, and everyone needing something managed. It falls to the women, generally. It always has. And before the death, too. 3 years of illness in the house. That wears people down in ways they don't always notice until afterward." Dorothea was quiet. She had the stillness of a woman exercising deliberate control, and beneath it the specific vibration of a woman who is very close to saying something she has been holding back for a long time. Miss Marple, who recognized this state precisely, said nothing at all, and looked at the apricot roses with every appearance of peaceful admiration. "She was not easy to care for," Dorothea said at last. "Edith, I want to be fair about that. She was not easy in her health, and she had not been easy before her illness, and I had been managing this house and her requirements for 22 years, and I am tired in the way you mean." She stopped. "But that isn't. I'm not saying it as a complaint. I'm saying it because I want you to understand that when I say I notice things, it wasn't because I was looking for them. I wasn't. I was simply too tired not to notice." Miss Marple turned to look at her then, with the full, quiet attention she reserved for moments that required it. "What did you notice?" Dorothea's hands were clasped in her lap with a firmness that was not composure but its substitute, that she was declining faster than she should have been. "Then, Doctor," Price expected. "I've watched illness before, my own mother and an aunt, and there's a pace to it, a kind of rhythm, and Edith's rhythm changed about 3 years ago. She had been declining slowly, and then she began declining more steadily. And the steadiness of it had a quality that I can't explain precisely except to say that it felt assisted." The word fell into the quiet of the garden with the weight of something that had been carried a long distance. "I know how that sounds," Dorothea said. It sounds like the observation of a woman who has been paying very close attention for a very long time, Miss Marple said. What did you do when you noticed? Nothing at first. I told myself I was wrong, that I was tired and unhappy and reading things into normal events, that it was grief arriving early. She looked down at her hands. And then 6 weeks ago I came across an entry in the farm accounts that I couldn't place. A purchase attributed to livestock, a compound I didn't recognize. I looked it up. She paused. It was a sedative, used in veterinary practice. I looked at when it had been purchased, and I looked at Edith's records. I have access to her medical correspondence. She gave me that years ago. And the timing matched a period when Dr. Price had noted her condition was unusually low. Miss Marple waited. I needed to understand what it was, Dorothea continued. The compound. What a pharmaceutical-grade equivalent would look like. How it would present. Whether it could be detected in combination with her existing medication. I ordered a reference compound through Agnes Tulse because I didn't want to go to our usual chemist and I didn't want to use the trade accounts. I was trying to be careful. A pause. I can see that it doesn't look careful from the outside. It looks, Miss Marple said gently, like exactly what you have described. A woman conducting a private investigation into her own household. She considered for a moment. Why have you not gone to the police? The silence that followed was long enough and shaped enough to be its own kind of answer. Dorothea looked out at the kitchen garden wall, at the bare espaliered pear trees against the brick, at the last of the apricot roses. Because I might be wrong, she said finally. Because he is my husband, and I have been married to him for 24 years, and I know how it looks when a wife accuses a husband of something like this, how it will be received, what it will mean if I'm mistaken. And because, she stopped, because you are not entirely certain, Miss Marple said quietly, that knowing you were right would be better than not knowing. Dorothea turned to look at her with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but the particular rawness of a person who has had an interior truth named aloud for the first time. Yes, she said, that. From somewhere behind them, the sound of footsteps on the gravel path, and both women looked up to see Gwen Ashcroft appearing at the kitchen garden gate, slightly breathless from the walk. I thought you'd both be out here, Gwen said, and then stopped, reading the quality of the silence. She looked at Dorothea, and then at Miss Marple, and then back at Dorothea. Forgive me, she said uncertainly. I can come back. Not at all, Miss Marple said, rising. We were just admiring the roses. She paused, looking back at Dorothea, who had picked up the secateurs again with the steadiness of a woman restoring her surface. They are quite remarkable at this time of year. One doesn't expect them to still be so good. Dorothea looked up briefly from the rose she was deadheading. Lawrence always says I spend too much time on them, she said. He says from a distance you can't tell the difference between a well-kept garden and one that's been left to itself. From a distance, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. One very rarely can. She took Gwen's arm, and they walked back through the kitchen garden gate. As they turned the corner of the house toward the lane, Gwen glanced back over her shoulder. That's odd, she said. I almost called out to Lawrence when I came around the path, but it was Dorothea. Yes, said Miss Marple. The coat, I think. They have the same walk, too. I've always noticed that. Long marriages do that sometimes. People start to move like each other. She paused. Actually, from the back, at a distance, I really couldn't. She stopped, and a particular expression crossed her face. The expression of a woman to whom something has just become slightly less certain than it was. Miss Marple looked at her with calm attention. You were going to say something. It's nothing. Gwen frowned. Only that I've been assuming, all this time, that the figure I saw from my window that night, the one in the dark coat, leaving through the side gate. I've been assuming it was Lawrence. She looked back once more at the kitchen garden wall. But I only saw them from behind and from above. Yes, said Miss Marple. I had been wondering about that. They walked back to the cottage in the pale October light, and Miss Marple said nothing further on the subject, and Gwen, for her part, spent the remainder of the walk quietly revising everything she thought she had been certain of. Inspector Carrow drove himself to Thistlewick in a black Wolseley that he parked with precision outside the village hall, which was the largest flat surface available, and which he appeared to have selected on principle rather than convenience. He was 45, medium height, with the kind of face that gave nothing away, not because it was guarded, but because it had genuinely settled into a resting state of patient consideration. He carried a briefcase that was neither new nor worn, and he moved through the village square with the unhurried confidence of a man who has learned that arriving somewhere quickly is rarely the most efficient use of having arrived. Gwen watched him from her kitchen window with the expression of a woman who is reassured and unsettled in equal measure by the arrival of official attention. "He doesn't look like a man who makes mistakes," she said. "No," Miss Marple agreed, from the table where she was writing letters. "That is precisely what concerns me." Carrow's presence in Thistlewick had been prompted, as Miss Marple had suspected it would be, by the solicitor. The filing of Neville's formal query regarding the estate. Not yet a legal challenge, but a documented concern raised with the firm that held Edith's will had triggered a procedural obligation on the solicitor's part to flag the circumstances of the death to the relevant county authority. This was not accusation. It was paperwork. But paperwork in Carrow's hands had a tendency to become something more purposeful. He interviewed the household at Crest Hollow over the course of Thursday morning, and he did so in the correct order. Clara first, then Neville, then Lawrence, then Dorotha. This was not alphabetical and not hierarchical. It was, Miss Marple recognized when Gwen reported the sequence, the order of a man who wanted his picture built from the outside in. The least interested parties first, the most pressured last. Miss Marple was not interviewed, being neither family nor staff, but she called at Crest Hollow at 11:30 on the pretext of returning Gwen's trollop, which she had taken back the previous day on precisely this pretext, and Mrs. Henning, who had developed a benign indifference to Miss Marple's appearances, showed her to the morning room without announcement. Carrow was in the library with Lawrence when she arrived. She sat in the morning room with the trollop and waited, which was the most useful thing she could do, and listened to the quality of the silences that came through the closed library door with the attentiveness of a woman who has learned that what a conversation withholds is frequently more informative than what it contains. Lawrence emerged at 12:15 with the composed expression of a man who has given a good account of himself and knows it. He greeted Miss Marple with the correct warmth of a host who finds a familiar visitor in his morning room and shows her through to the drawing-room for tea, and he said that Inspector Carrow was very thorough and that the whole business was naturally distressing, but that he understood the need for due diligence, and Miss Marple agreed that due diligence was always wise, and they sat together for 20 minutes in the careful conversation of two people who are each concealing something from the other, and are both aware of this, and neither intends to acknowledge it. Carrow came for 12:40. He looked at Miss Marple with the brief, recalibrating attention of a man who had not expected to find an elderly woman in a floral blouse reading Trollope in the drawing-room of a house he was investigating, and then he looked at Lawrence, who said, "This is Miss Marple. She's a friend of the family," with a fluency that Miss Marple found instructive. "Miss Marple," Caro said, and sat down. He had the quality of a man who sits down rather than taking a seat. Something settled and deliberate about it. "Were you acquainted with Mrs. Brentwood?" "Through Gwen Ashcroft, who is an old friend. I arrived the day before yesterday to pay my respects." "Fortuitous timing," Caro said, in the tone of a man who does not believe in fortuitous timing. "I prefer to think of it as good friendship," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Gwen was troubled, and I came. One does." Caro looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man making an assessment he would not share aloud, and then he thanked Lawrence for his time and showed himself out with the self-sufficiency of a man who does not require to be escorted. Miss Marple set down the trollop. "He is very good," she said to Lawrence. "Yes," Lawrence said. He was looking at the door through which Caro had departed. "I imagine he is." Gwen had the afternoon's information within 3 hours of Caro's departure, through the mechanism of Agnes Tulse, who had been interviewed at 1 o'clock and had arrived at Gwen's door at 2:45 with a tin of shortbread and an account so thorough it required the shortbread to sustain it. Caro had been primarily interested, Agnes reported, in 2 things. The first was the question of who had been at Crest Hollow on the night of Edith's death, and specifically the question of the side gate, which Gwen had mentioned in her own brief interview that morning. The second was the question of pharmaceutical substances in the household, prompted, Agnes understood, by a routine check of local supplier records that had turned up Dorothea's catalog order. "He asked me about the order 3 times, Agnes said, with the satisfaction of a woman whose record-keeping has proved its value. "In 3 different ways. I told him the same thing each time, which is the advantage of simply telling the truth." "What did you tell him?" Gwen asked. "That Mrs. Dorothea Brentwood placed an order 8 weeks ago for a sedative compound through the specialist catalog. That she asked for discretion. That I had been discreet until asked directly by a police inspector, at which point discretion became obstruction." Agnes selected a shortbread. He seemed satisfied, though not pleasantly satisfied. More the way a man looks when a piece fits where he expected it to fit. Miss Marple, who had been listening from the armchair near the window, set down her tea. "That," she said, "is the look one should always be most concerned about." Caro returned to Crest Hollow at 4 o'clock, by which time the light had gone entirely, and the house had taken on the specific quality of darkness it wore in early evening, not hostile, but ungiving. Mrs. Henning answered the door. The interview that followed was with Dorothea, and it lasted 40 minutes. And when Caro left, he sat in the Wolseley outside the house for 7 minutes before driving away, which Gwen observed from her upstairs window and reported with the conscientiousness of a woman who has accepted that observation is now her primary contribution. Miss Marple received this information without expression. 7 minutes, she said. "I timed it. He is building something," Miss Marple said. "The catalog order." Gwen's sighting of a figure in a dark coat leaving through the side gate. "And whatever Dorothea said to him this afternoon, which I suspect was truthful and therefore damaging." She was quiet for a moment. "She told him she had ordered the compound for personal research. I imagine she said she had concerns about the household. I imagine she tried to explain. Would he have believed her? He would have noted her explanation," Miss Marple said, "which is not the same thing." She rose and moved to the window. The lane outside was empty, the elm trees at the end of Crest Hollow's drive visible as dark shapes against the last of the evening sky. A woman who orders a sedative compound, who is seen leaving a house at midnight on the night of a death, who says she had concerns. Inspector Caro has encountered this shape before, I think. The domestic poisoning case. The wife with access and motive and a carefully prepared explanation. It is a very recognizable shape, but she didn't do it. No, she didn't do it." Miss Marple turned from the window. She was investigating the person who did, which looks, from the outside, almost identical to the person who did doing their preliminary research. She paused. "I need to speak to Dr. Price tomorrow, and I need to look at that milk warmer. How will you manage that?" Miss Marple considered. "I will think of something," she said. "I usually do." She managed it the following morning through the most reliable mechanism available to a woman of her age and apparent harmlessness, which was the simple act of being present in a kitchen at the right moment and asking Mrs. Henning, with genuine interest, about the arrangement for making hot drinks at night for invalids. Mrs. Henning, who had been making hot milk for Edith Brentwood for 3 years, and who found the topic of her own domestic competence inexhaustible, talked for 11 minutes. She described the milk warmer, a small copper-bottomed pan kept on the back of the range, dedicated to this single purpose, and she described the routine of it, and she described how Mr. Lawrence had always been so kind about carrying it up, which saved her legs on the stairs. Miss Marple asked, with the idle curiosity of a woman interested in kitchen equipment, whether she might see it. Mrs. Henning produced it from the shelf beside the range, with the pride of a craftsperson presenting a tool well maintained. It was a small pan, copper-based, with a bone handle worn smooth with use. Clean, clearly. Thoroughly cleaned, in fact, far more recently than its last use for milk, which had been 5 days ago. Miss Marple looked at it with the expression of a woman admiring a well-kept piece of kitchen equipment, and she noted the particular brightness of the interior base, which was the brightness of something that had been recently and thoroughly scoured. "How lovely," she said. "You keep everything beautifully." Mrs. Henning said that she did her best. That evening, in the drawing-room at Gwen's cottage, Miss Marple sat for a long time in the good chair by the fire and said very little. The case against Dorothea was building with the reliable momentum of a correctly assembled argument, and it was wrong from its foundation, and the milk warmer had been cleaned in the 5 days since Edith's death by someone who was not Mrs. Henning, and Dr. Price had a note in his records from the previous winter that he needed to find. And there was a ledger entry in the farm accounts that Neville had shown her, briefly, 3 days ago, in the library, that she had read and committed to memory, and which described, in Lawrence's private abbreviation, a purchase under the livestock heading that referred to no animals she could identify. She picked up her knitting, which she had brought, and had not yet touched, and began, and the needles moved with the steady rhythm of a woman who is not thinking about her knitting at all. "You should ask Inspector Caro," Gwen said from the sofa, "about the post-mortem." "I intend to," Miss Marple said. "Tomorrow. Do you think he'll listen?" Miss Marple considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "He is a careful man," she said finally. "Careful men, in my experience, will listen to an argument they cannot immediately disprove, provided it is presented to them as information rather than correction. Nobody," she added, with the mild certainty of long observation, "likes to be corrected, but everyone likes to be the first to know something." She knitted 3 more rows in silence. "He's going to move against Dorothea," she said. "I should think by the end of the week. We have perhaps 2 days." Outside, the wind had picked up from the north, and the elms at the end of the Crest Hollow drive were moving. At last, all of them together, the crows long gone to wherever crows go when the temperature drops and the light fails, and the village settles into its long October dark. Clara Jevons lived, within Crest Hollow, in the 2 rooms at the end of the east corridor that had been allocated to her when she first arrived 20 years ago, and which she had made, by incremental and unannounced effort, into something that was entirely hers. The sitting room was small and south-facing and contained a great many books, a good lamp, a writing desk that had been a gift from Edith on some forgotten occasion, and the accumulated objects of a life lived in close proximity to another person's life. Not mementos exactly, but the residue of long attendance. A paperweight from a holiday they had taken together in Cornwall in 1948. A small watercolor of the garden at Crest Hollow, painted by a visiting niece of Edith's who had some talent and no ambition. A photograph of the two of them, taken at a garden party in what appeared to be 1952, in which Edith was looking at the camera and Clara was looking at Edith with the expression of a woman who has made her peace with the direction of her attention. Miss Marple arrived at 2:30, when the house was at its quietest. Lawrence out, Neville in Bristol for the afternoon on an errand related to the solicitor, Dorothea resting with the particular rest of a woman under strain. Mrs. Henning had admitted her with the equanimity of a woman who has accepted Miss Marple as a recurring feature of the household, and shown her upstairs without announcement. Clara opened the door in the manner of a woman who had been expecting a specific visitor and had been deciding, since the knock, whether she was ready. "Come in," she said. "I've made tea. I find it helps to have something to do with my hands." The sitting room was warm and precisely ordered and smelled of books, and a specific lavender soap that would smell, Miss Marple thought, for the rest of her life, of this week. Clara poured with the steadiness of practice, and sat in the chair nearest the window. And Miss Marple sat opposite, and for a moment they regarded each other with the mutual appraisal of two women who have independently arrived at a similar understanding of the situation, and are now determining how much of that understanding to name aloud. "You know something," Clara said. It was not a question. "I know several things," Miss Marple said. "I am here because I believe you know one thing I don't, and because I think you have been waiting for someone to ask you the right question." Clara looked at her hands around the teacup. They were the hands of a woman of 62, who had spent a great deal of time doing practical things. Yes, writing letters, making arrangements, managing the 10,000 small organizational tasks that attend a long illness. And they were very still now, with the stillness of hands that have run out of tasks. "She knew," Clara said. "I want to say that first, before anything else. Edith knew that something was happening to her. Not what, and not who. She was not certain enough for that, and I think she was afraid of being certain. But she said to me, more than once in the last year, that her body was doing something that her illness did not explain. She said it in the way she said most important things, which was obliquely and without apparent emotion, so that one could choose to hear it as a passing observation if one wished." She paused. "I chose for a long time to hear it that way. I am not proud of that." "You were afraid," Miss Marple said. "That is not the same as being complicit." "I've been telling myself that." Clara's voice was even the voice of a woman who has had this internal argument many times and has not yet won it conclusively. She told me other things, too, toward the end. She revised her will 14 months ago. Not dramatically, but significantly. She did not tell Lawrence. She told me, and she told her solicitor, and I think she told one or two other people in ways that would only be understood after the fact. She set down the teacup. She was protecting her intentions. She didn't trust that they would survive her. "She was quite right not to," Miss Marple said gently. "What was in the revision?" "Her bequest to me was increased substantially, and Lawrence's share of the liquid assets was reduced. Not disinherited, nothing so dramatic, but reduced in the specific way that would affect his ability to use the estate as security for a large financial arrangement." Clara said this precisely, as though reciting something she had memorized. She knew about the arrangement with the property developer. She did not approve of it, and she had decided that her estate would not facilitate it. This was her final exercise of authority over a house she had managed for 50 years, and she was not going to relinquish it. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. The window behind Clara showed the south garden, the rose wall where she had sat with Dorothea 2 days ago, the espagered pears gone bare against the brick. The afternoon light was thin and exact, the kind of light that showed things clearly without warmth. "Clara," she said, "I want to ask you about a letter." Clara looked up. "You have been Mrs. Brentwood's correspondent for 20 years. You have posted letters for her regularly. Agnes Tulse told me about your Tuesday and Thursday visits. But you have not been to the post office since Edith died." Miss Marple held her gaze. "I think there is a letter you have not yet posted." The silence that followed was the silence of a door that has been standing closed for some days and is now, at the correct pressure, opening. Clara rose without speaking and went to the writing desk. From the small left-hand drawer, the drawer a person uses for things they are keeping close but not acting on, she took a white envelope, sealed, addressed in a hand that was not Clara's own, but had the careful deliberateness of a person writing under effort, and held it for a moment before bringing it to Miss Marple. "She dictated it to me," Clara said, "in the last week." She was very clear that morning, clearer than she had been in months, which I thought at the time was simply a good day. I think now that she was making a specific effort. She sat back down. "She said she wanted it sent to her solicitor. She said I should post it within the week. And then a pause. She died 3 days later, and I couldn't. I kept thinking I would, and I kept not, and now it has been 5 days, and I still have not sent it." Miss Marple held the envelope. It was addressed to a Mr. Gerald Fawkes, solicitor, at an address in Dorchester. The handwriting was uneven but deliberate. The writing of a woman whose hand is not fully reliable, but whose intention is entirely so. "May I read it?" "That is why I haven't posted it," Clara said. I thought if I sent it without anyone else knowing what it contained, and if things went as I am afraid they may go, it might simply become part of the estate correspondence. Managed. Filed? She looked at the envelope with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for 5 days and is deciding whether to put it down. She wrote it for someone to find. I don't think she intended it to be quietly absorbed. Miss Marple opened the envelope with the careful attention of a woman who understands that what she is holding is significant and intends to treat it accordingly. The letter was 2 pages, written in Edith Brentwood's hand, that careful, labored hand, on Crest Hollow notepaper. It began with the formal salutation of a woman who had written business letters all her life and saw no reason to change her register for this one. It covered, in order, the confirmation of her revised will and her wish that it be executed precisely as written without accommodation of subsequent family pressure. A note regarding the property development arrangement and her explicit instruction that her estate not be used as security for it under any circumstances. And then, in the final paragraph, the passage that Miss Marple read twice, and then held very still with for a long moment. I write also to note, for the record, and for whatever use may be made of it, that I have experienced, for a period I now believe to be approximately 3 years, a heaviness and a progressive difficulty of the kind that my illness alone does not explain, and that Dr. Price has not been able to account for to my satisfaction. I do not make accusations, having no evidence to offer. I say only that I am aware of something. I have been aware of it for some time. I chose, for reasons that seemed sufficient to me at the time, not to name it, because the naming of it would have required a certainty I did not possess, and a consequence I was not ready to precipitate. I am naming it now, such as it is, and leaving it in your hands, in the hands of those you judge competent to receive it, to make of it what they will. I am not, I think, simply dying of old age." Edith Brentwood Miss Marple sat for a long moment, with the letter in her hands and the thin October light on the window and the garden beyond it, quiet and exact. "She knew," Clara said again from her chair. It was not the same statement it had been when she said it 5 minutes ago. It had more weight in it now. "She knew," Miss Marple agreed. "And she did what she could, in the only way available to her." She folded the letter back into its envelope with the careful respect one gives to the last words of a person who chose them well. "Clara, on the last night, when you brought the milk, you said you sat with her for 20 minutes and she told you to go to bed." "Yes." "Did she say anything that night that she had not said before? Anything that seemed, in retrospect, different in quality?" Clara thought about this with the seriousness it required. Outside, a cloud moved across the thin sun, and the room went briefly darker. "She said she was tired," Clara said slowly, "which she always said, and she said she stopped. She said she hoped things would be clearer soon, which I thought she meant her mind. She had been somewhat confused in the previous days." A pause, and she said, "Thank you for staying, Clara." She had never said it quite like that, as though she were concluding something. Miss Marple looked at the envelope in her hands. "Thank you for staying." A woman settling her accounts in the only currency she had left. "And then Lawrence came along the corridor," Miss Marple said, "as I was leaving." "Yes, he was carrying something. I assumed it was the milk, that he'd met Mrs. Henning on the stairs. He said he'd take it in, that I should go to bed." Clara's voice was very level now, the level of a voice that has expended all its available emotion on a single truth and has nothing left for the periphery. He was kind about it. He said I needed rest." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I imagine he was very kind." She put the letter in her bag with the care of a woman securing something she intends to act on before the day is out, and she looked at Clara Javens, who was sitting in her chair by the window of her 2 rooms that were entirely her own, surrounded by the residue of 20 years of devoted attendance on a woman now gone, and she said, with the simplicity that the moment required, "You did the right thing, keeping it. I want you to know that." Clara looked out at the garden. "I wasn't sure I had," she said. "I kept thinking I should have posted it immediately. That my reasons for not posting it were sentimental." "Your reasons for not posting it," Miss Marple said, rising, "were entirely correct, even if you did not know precisely why they were correct. You were waiting for someone to ask the right question." She picked up her bag. "And now I am going to call on Inspector Carrow." She paused at the door and looked back at Clara, who had not moved from her chair. "She was lucky," Miss Marple said, "in her companion." Whatever else was true of this house, Clara said nothing, but something in her face changed very slightly, in the way of a person who has been holding a particular posture for a very long time, and has at last been given permission to set it down. The morning of Friday, the 23rd, was the first morning since Miss Marple's arrival that the sky showed any intention of clearing. The clouds had thinned overnight to a high pale gauze, through which the sun was visible as a suggestion rather than a fact, and the air had the particular quality of cold that is honest rather than threatening, the cold of a day that knows what it is and is not pretending to be otherwise. Miss Marple walked to Crest Hollow at 10:30 with a copy of Thistlewick, a brief history under her arm which she had read the previous evening with genuine interest, and which now served as her pretext. She intended to return it to the library, where she had acquired it. This was not entirely truthful, as she had purchased it from Agnes Tulse, and could therefore return it to no one with any logical claim. But it was the kind of pretext that required no examination, and Miss Marple had found, over a long life, that pretexts which require no examination are the most reliable kind. She had spent the previous evening with Inspector Carrow. The meeting had taken place at 6 o'clock in the private sitting room of the Thistlewick Arms, which Carrow had commandeered as an interview room with the discreet authority of a man accustomed to commandeering things discreetly. He had listened to what Miss Marple said with the stillness of a man who has trained himself not to react to information until he has determined what the information is actually telling him. When she had finished, the letter, the milk warmer, the ledger entry Neville had shown her, the timeline of the medication, he was quiet for 45 seconds, which she counted. "You're asking me to request a post-mortem toxicology screen," he said. "I'm giving you the information on which you might decide to request one," Miss Marple said. "The decision is entirely yours. On the basis of a letter written by the deceased, a ledger entry you read once at a distance, and a cleaned milk pan, and 31 months of veterinary sedative purchases attributed to a livestock heading for a period in which the horses at Crest Hollow were, by Mr. Lawrence Brentwood's own account to me, exceptionally calm and without medical incident." She folded her hands. "I am not a chemist, Inspector, but I understand that fluonisone-based compounds, used in combination with existing barbiturate sleep medication in an elderly patient over a prolonged period, would produce a cumulative respiratory effect consistent with the natural decline of a woman of Mrs. Brentwood's age and condition. I understand also that this would not be visible in a standard post-mortem without a specific screen. I would not ask for your time if I were not quite certain it would be worth it." Another silence. Carrow looked at the letter, which Miss Marple had placed on the table between them. She had not handed it to him, which was a distinction he appeared to notice and respect. "You understand," he said carefully, "that I have a developing case pointing in another direction." "I understand that the case pointing in another direction is made of the same materials as this one, arranged differently," Miss Marple said. "Mrs. Dorothea Brentwood ordered a pharmaceutical compound because she was investigating what was happening in her own household. She visited Crest Hollow at midnight on the night in question because she was trying to find evidence. She has not gone to the police because she is afraid of being wrong about her husband, which is the most human thing about this entire situation." She paused. "She is not your poisoner, Inspector. She is your only other witness." Carrow had looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has been told something he needed to hear and is working through the specific discomfort of having needed to hear it from an elderly woman with a floral blouse and a copy of a local history booklet. "I'll need to speak with Mrs. Brentwood again," he said. "The daughter-in-law. I think you'll find her considerably more forthcoming than she was yesterday," Miss Marple said. "She was waiting for permission to tell the truth. People generally are, in my experience. They simply need someone to make it clear that the truth is the safer option." She had left the Arms at 7 and walked back to Gwen's cottage, through the dark with the letter in her bag and the specific satisfaction of a woman who has done the most important thing and now has the remaining pieces to gather. Crest Hollow admitted her at 10:45. Mrs. Henning, who had long since ceased to find Miss Marple's appearances surprising, informed her that Mr. Lawrence was in the estate office and that she was welcome to leave the booklet in the library, which Miss Marple said was very kind. She spent 7 minutes in the library, which was sufficient. The estate desk was in the same position it had occupied during her previous visit, the ledgers stacked to the left of the writing surface, in the order of a man who is systematic but pressed for time, the current year on top, the previous years in descending order below. She did not touch them. She stood at the desk and looked at the current year's farm account ledger, which was closed, and she looked at the position of the bookmark, a folded piece of paper, which protruded from a section approximately 2/3 through. She had seen the relevant entry 3 days ago, when Neville had opened it briefly, and then closed it with the dismissive comment that Lawrence's notation system was impenetrable. She had read it in the 3 seconds it was visible, and she had committed it to memory with the precision of a woman who has learned, over many decades, that 3 seconds is sometimes all one gets. The entry, translated from Lawrence's private abbreviations, read Oct 51, LS Agric, AC Flan Comp X4, Livestocks 10, seasonal dated October 1951, and again in March 1952, and again. She had seen 3 entries in those 3 seconds. In August 1952, flew on its own compound, purchased 4 units at a time, 3 times in 12 months, attributed to seasonal livestock sedation. The horses at Crest Hollow had not required veterinary sedation in the relevant period. Lawrence had said so himself, with the ease of a man stating a fact he had no reason to guard. They've been particularly well settled this year. She replaced the booklet on the library shelf, a gesture of genuine tidiness, and went in search of Lawrence. She found him as Mrs. Henning had indicated in the estate office, a small room off the main corridor that smelled of old paper and wood oil, and the specific closed window cold of a room that is heated only when occupied. He was at the desk with a spread of correspondence that he gathered together without haste when she knocked and entered, and he greeted her with the composed warmth that was, she had concluded, his permanent register. Not performed exactly, but maintained with the same careful consistency with which one maintains a structural wall. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry, were we expecting you?" "Not at all. I was returning the booklet to the library. I borrowed it from your shelves on an earlier visit. I hope you don't mind, and I thought I would look in. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not in the least. Come through to the drawing room. I'll ask Mrs. Henning for coffee. Please don't trouble yourself. I won't stay long." She settled into the chair opposite the desk with the air of a woman entirely comfortable in estate offices. "I was hoping to see the stables, actually. I mentioned the horses on my first visit. You said they had been particularly settled this year. I always think one can judge a household by how it keeps its animals." Something passed through Lawrence's face, a movement so brief and so well managed that a less attentive observer would have registered nothing. Then, "Of course, I'll take you round myself." The stable block was a 5-minute walk from the house, east of the kitchen garden, along the path that ran beside the garden wall. It was a good stable, Georgian, matching the house, with 4 loose boxes of which 2 were occupied, and 2 had been converted to storage. The mare was a bay, heavy-boned and placid. The gelding was grey and younger, with the slightly elevated attention of a horse that is intelligent and insufficiently exercised. Both were in good condition. Both were, as Lawrence had said, extremely settled. Miss Marple walked the length of the loose boxes with the appreciative attention of a woman who respects animals and knows something about them. And she asked the kinds of questions that a woman who respects animals and knows something about them would ask. About feeding, about exercise, about the winter routine. And Lawrence answered them with the ease of a man on familiar ground. And the ease was genuine, she thought. He did love the horses. That at least was real. "You manage them yourself?" she asked. "Mostly. We have a part-time groom, young Adkins from the village, 3 mornings a week. The daily care is mine." A slight warmth in his voice, the first warmth she had heard that was not managed. "I find it useful. It requires the kind of attention that is different from paperwork. It clears the head. I imagine it does." She paused at the grey gelding's box, and the horse extended its nose with the amiable curiosity of an animal that encounters few strangers. She offered the back of her hand in the correct manner. "Have you had any cause for veterinary intervention this year?" They both looked so remarkably well. "None at all." He said it with the pride of a competent stockman. "I haven't had the vet out to either of them since March, and that was routine." "And in previous years?" "Horses can sometimes be prone to anxiety in the autumn, the shorter days, the change in routine. Not these two. The mare has always been steady. The gelding was nervous when I first got him, 3 years ago, but he settled very quickly. I've had no trouble with either of them since." He said it with the natural fluency of the truth, which was, Miss Marple reflected, the most interesting thing he had said in 6 days. He was telling the truth. The horses had not needed sedating. The compound had not been used on the horses. She looked at him. She looked at him with the quiet directness of a woman who has in this moment finished gathering and is now simply seeing Lawrence Brentwood, 51, the heir to a house he has been dismantling in slow motion, the son of a woman he administered a veterinary sedative to over 31 months, the man who carried the milk upstairs with the kindness of a devoted son, because it was the only moment of access that was reliably his. He met her gaze with the steadiness of a man who has been managing his expression for 3 years, and is still at this moment managing it. But his eyes, those tired eyes that Clara had noted and that sleep could not fix, had for just a moment the quality of a man who has seen that the ground beneath him is no longer solid and does not yet know where to step. "How very fortunate," Miss Marple said pleasantly, for the second time in their acquaintance, "to have horses with such steady temperaments." She thanked him for the tour. She declined the offered coffee. She walked back along the path beside the kitchen garden wall with the measured pace of a woman with nowhere to be, and she did not look back at the stable block, and she did not look back at the house. She went directly to Gwen's cottage and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "I am going to call on Inspector Carrow this evening. I should like you to come with me." Gwen set down the kettle. "Is it enough?" Miss Marple thought of the letter, and the milk warmer, and the ledger with its 3 careful entries, and the horses that had not needed sedating, and Lawrence's eyes in the moment before he looked away. "It is very nearly enough," she said. "Dr. Price's notes will make it enough, and the post-mortem screen, when it comes back, will make it certain." She accepted the cup that Gwen brought her. "But I want to move before the end of the week, before Inspector Carrow moves first, in the wrong direction." Outside the window the pale sun had given up its effort, and the sky had returned to its customary October pewter, and the elms at the end of Crest Hollow's drive stood bare and still in the afternoon cold, the crows back in their branches, 7 of them now, sitting in the specific patient way of birds that are waiting for something they are in no hurry about. Miss Marple looked at them through the window for a moment, and then looked away, and drank her tea. Saturday morning arrived with rain, not the tentative rain of the previous days, but a committed, settled rain that had decided to be there for some time and had arranged itself accordingly. It came in from the west in long gray curtains that reduced the view from Gwen's kitchen window to the near garden, and a suggestion of elms beyond, and it drummed on the cottage roof with the steady, impersonal persistence of weather that has no opinion about the people beneath it. Miss Marple was dressed by 6:30, and at the kitchen table by 6:45, with tea, and the previous evening's notes, written in the small, precise hand she had used for 60 years, and which remained legible even when written quickly. She was reviewing them with the attention of a woman doing a final check before a journey. Not looking for new information, but confirming that what she had was correctly understood and correctly ordered. The evening with Carrow had gone as well as could be expected. which was to say that it had gone approximately as she had planned, and rather less smoothly than she would have wished. Caro was a careful man and a good one, and careful good men, in Miss Marple's experience, had a specific difficulty with being redirected once they had committed their attention to a particular course. They were not stubborn exactly. Stubbornness implied an emotional investment that Caro did not appear to possess, but they had a methodical momentum that required a specific quality of counter-argument to interrupt. She had provided the counter-argument. She had given him the letter, Edith's letter in Edith's hand, and she had given him the precise entry from the farm account ledger, written from memory and verified against what Neville had shown her, and against what she had seen herself in the library on Friday morning. She had given him Dr. Price's self-disclosure, which she had finally drawn from Price in full on Friday afternoon in his surgery, where he had produced his records with the relief of a man who has been wanting to hand something to someone for several days. The note was dated the 14th of November, 1952. It read in Price's careful clinical hand, "Patient's respiration notably shallow for second consecutive visit. Query, cardiac deterioration or external factor. Cold weather may be contributory, will monitor." And then, 2 visits later, in December, respiration somewhat improved, cold weather abating. No further action at present. He had stopped at that point and looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a man who has read his own handwriting and found it wanting. "I should have pressed further," he said. "The November entry was a question I did not answer." "You asked the right question," Miss Marple said. "The answer was simply not yet available to you." She had taken the copies he offered with careful hands. Caro had read all of it. He had been quiet for a long time in the way of a man restructuring. Then he had said, "The toxicology screen will take 10 days to 2 weeks. I requested it this morning, after our conversation last night." Miss Marple had not shown her relief. That was the right decision. If it comes back positive for a flunisone compound in combination with the existing barbiturates, I have a case. He looked at the letter again. If it doesn't, I have a series of suggestive circumstances that a competent defense counsel would dismantle in 40 minutes. "It will come back positive," Miss Marple said. "I am quite certain of that." "You may be certain," Caro said. "I require evidence." He paused. "But I am inclined to wait for it rather than proceed without it." Another pause, briefer. "In another direction. Dorothea Brentwood will cooperate fully," Miss Marple said. "If you ask her the right questions, with the right framing, not as a suspect, but as a witness who has information you need, she will tell you everything she found in those farm accounts, and everything she has suspected for the past 6 weeks. She is not protecting her husband. She is protecting herself from the consequences of being right about him. Those are different things." She had left the Arms at 9 o'clock, in the rain, with the umbrella she had brought from St. Mary Mead, and which Gwen had told her was excessive for October, and which had now been vindicated on 3 separate occasions. The difficulty announced itself at 8:15 Saturday morning in the form of Agnes Tulse, who arrived at Gwen's door with her coat still buttoned, and an expression that was doing its best to be merely informational. "I thought you should know," Agnes said, accepting neither tea nor a chair, a reliable indication of urgency in a woman who habitually accepted both. "Inspector Caro telephoned the station at Dorchester last night. Late. My nephew is a constable there. Not on this case, but in the building. He said there was a warrant being prepared." "For whom?" Gwen asked. Agnes looked at Miss Marple. "For Mrs. Dorothea Brentwood. Formal questioning. Not an arrest, but the kind of formal questioning that becomes an arrest if the answers aren't satisfactory." She paused. "They're expected this morning. Before noon, my nephew thought." Miss Marple set down her tea with the careful precision of a woman controlling a response. She had miscalculated. Not the argument. The argument had been sound, but the speed of Caro's institutional momentum, which had apparently continued moving in its original direction even as his intellectual attention had shifted. The warrant had likely been prepared before their conversation last night, and had not been withdrawn because withdrawing it required a certainty he did not yet have. She was on her feet and into her coat before Gwen had fully processed the information. "My umbrella," she said. "By the door," Gwen said, already reaching for her own coat. They arrived at Crest Hollow at 8:42. The rain had thickened and the drive was puddled, the elms dripping in long, steady drops that hit the gravel with a sound like distant applause. "Mrs." Henning opened the door with the expression of a woman who has already had a difficult morning and is not surprised to find it continuing. Dorothea was in the morning room with a cup of tea she had not drunk, and a copy of the Times she had not opened. She was dressed, which Miss Marple found significant. A woman who has been expecting something and has decided to meet it standing, which in Dorothea's case meant fully clothed and composed at 8:30 on a Saturday morning, when there was no other reason to be either. She looked up when Miss Marple came in, and her expression did something complicated and then settled. "He's coming this morning," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, but I am here first." Miss Marple sat down opposite her, in the direct way of a woman with limited time and no inclination to waste it on social approach. "Dorothea, you told Inspector Caro yesterday that you had concerns about the household. You told him about the compound you ordered. You did not tell him specifically what you found in the farm accounts, because you were still afraid of being wrong. Yes. I need you to tell me now precisely what you found. Not what you suspected, what you found." Dorothea set down the untouched tea. 3 entries in the farm account over 14 months, she said, with the clarity of a woman who has gone over this so many times it has become recitation. October 1951, March 1952, August 1952. A compound listed under livestock sedation, purchased through the agricultural supplier in units of 4. The notation is Lawrence, L.S. Agric, ACC, Flan, Comp, the abbreviation he uses for fluanisone. I know his notation because I helped him develop it when we were first married and the bookkeeping was done jointly. She paused. There were no veterinary visits in those periods corresponding to the purchases. I checked the veterinary invoices, which are kept separately. There is no record of the compound being used on either horse. Where are the invoices now? Dorothea looked at the writing desk in the corner of the room. A small lady's desk, different from the estate desk in the library. She rose and opened the lower left drawer and produced a manila envelope. "I made copies," she said, 3 weeks ago, before I was certain enough to do anything with them." Miss Marple took the envelope. Inside, 3 carbon copies of the farm account entries, carefully transcribed in Dorothea's hand. The corresponding veterinary invoice file showing no flunisone usage, and a folded piece of paper on which Dorothea had written, in a clear and steady hand, a 6-week timeline of her own investigation. What she'd found when she had found it, and what actions she had taken, including the catalogue order, and the night visit to Crest Hollow, which she had annotated with the specific reason. Attempting to locate the compound in the estate stores for removal before it could be disposed of. She had been trying, Miss Marple understood now with complete clarity, to find the evidence and secure it before it disappeared. She had not gone to the police because she did not yet have enough. She had been conducting an investigation with the thoroughness of a woman who knew that an unsubstantiated accusation against a husband in a household context required more than suspicion to survive. You were right, Miss Marple said, about all of it. Dorothea sat down again. I know, she said. I have known for 6 weeks. Knowing and being able to do anything useful with it are not the same thing. They are about to become the same thing. Miss Marple put the envelope in her bag beside Edith's letter and Price's notes and stood. When Inspector Carrow arrives, you will give him your timeline document and the copied entries, and you will tell him exactly what you have told me, in exactly the order you told it, without qualification or apology. You are not a suspect. You are a witness who has been doing the police's work for 6 weeks without their resources or their authority, and you have produced better documentation than most professional investigators would have managed under the circumstances. Dorothea looked at her with the expression that Miss Marple had seen twice now. The particular rawness of a person having an interior truth named aloud. You sound very certain, she said. I am certain because the evidence is certain, Miss Marple said. The toxicology screen will confirm it. The farm accounts will confirm it. Edith's letter will confirm it. You have nothing to fear from the truth. The truth in this case is entirely on your side. She had turned toward the door when she heard the Wolseley in the drive. Carrow came in from the rain with 2 constables, and the contained expression of a man executing a decision he had made and intended to see through. He stopped when he saw Miss Marple standing in the morning-room doorway. They regarded each other for a moment. Inspector Carrow, Miss Marple said pleasantly. How fortunate! I was hoping to speak with you. Miss Marple, his voice was carefully even. I have a warrant, yes. I know what you have. She stepped back from the doorway and opened it wider, in the manner of a woman inviting someone into a room for a specific purpose. Before you proceed with it, I wonder if you might give me 10 minutes. I have some documentation that was not available to us last evening, and I think you will find it materially relevant. Carrow looked at the 2 constables. Something in his expression shifted. Not defeat, but the specific adjustment of a careful man who has encountered a counter-argument he cannot immediately dismiss. 10 minutes, he said. Miss Marple sat down. She placed Edith's letter on the table. She placed Dorothea's timeline and the copied farm account entries beside it. She placed Dr. Price's transcribed notes beside those. And she placed, last, the veterinary invoice file showing the absence of any record corresponding to the compound's purchase. She did not present them dramatically. She arranged them in the order a careful reader would find most useful, and she waited. Carrow read. He read all of it, without rushing, with the focused attention of a man who has decided that the 10 minutes he has agreed to give will be used properly. The 2 constables stood near the door with the slightly uncertain quality of authority that has been for the moment suspended. When he finished, he was quiet for a time that Miss Marple did not count, because she did not need to. The toxicology screen, he said at last. Will confirm it, Miss Marple said. I am quite certain. Another silence. Then Carrow looked at Dorothea, who had sat through the entire proceeding with the stillness of a woman who has passed through the worst of something, and is now simply waiting to find out what comes next. Mrs. Brentwood, he said, I'd like to ask you some questions, not as a suspect. He paused on the distinction with the care of a man who understands its significance. As a witness, Dorothea looked at him steadily. Yes, she said. I thought you might, eventually. She glanced at Marple once, briefly, the look not of gratitude exactly, but of one careful person acknowledging another. And then she turned to face Carrow and began, in a clear and level voice, at the beginning. Miss Marple moved quietly to the chair near the window, out of the way, but not out of the room. And the rain came down on Crest Hollow, and the warrant stayed in Carrow's briefcase, and outside the drawing-room window, the elms dripped steadily into the puddled drive, and the crows sat in their branches without moving, patient and black and still. The toxicology screen came back on Thursday. Caro telephoned Gwen's cottage at 8:30 in the morning, and Miss Marple took the call in the hallway with the telephone receiver held in both hands and listened without interruption for 4 minutes. When she replaced the receiver, she stood for a moment in the hallway with the particular stillness of a woman at the end of something, and then she went through to the kitchen where Gwen was making toast and said, "It is confirmed. Fluonisone compound, in combination with the prescribed barbiturates, at levels consistent with prolonged incremental administration over a period of not less than 2 years." She sat down at the kitchen table. "Inspector Caro will be at Crest Hollow at 10 o'clock. He has asked that I be present." Gwen set down the toast. She did not say anything for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the October morning was clear for the first time in a week, a pale, washed clarity that had come through in the night and left the garden bright and very still. The elms at the end of Crest Hollow's drive were visible from where they sat, bare against the blue, and they were empty. The crows were gone. "All of them?" Gwen said, following her gaze. "All of them," Miss Marple said. "Since yesterday evening, I think." She drank her tea and ate her toast with the unhurried attention of a woman preparing properly for something that requires preparation, and at 9:30 she put on her coat and her sensible shoes, and walked with Gwen to Crest Hollow through the clear, cold morning. Caro had asked that the household be gathered in the drawing-room at 10, which Mrs. Henning had arranged with the careful neutrality of a woman who has understood for some days that something significant is approaching, and has decided that her role is to manage the domestic surface of it without comment. Clara was there when they arrived, and Neville, who had come up from Bristol the previous afternoon on a telephone call from Caro that had told him only that his presence was requested. Dorothea was there, in the chair nearest the window, with her hands in her lap, and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a specific morning for 6 weeks and finds it, now that it has arrived, both exactly as she imagined and entirely different. Lawrence came in last. He came in from the corridor door rather than the hall, which meant he had come from the estate office, and he was carrying a folder of correspondence that he set on the side table with the deliberateness of a man maintaining his routine, because the routine is the thing that is holding him together. He greeted Caro with the composed courtesy that was his register in all official interactions, and he greeted Miss Marple with the same composed courtesy. And he sat in the chair by the fire. His mother's chair, the chair Edith had occupied for 50 years of married life and 10 years of widowhood, with the ease of a man who has not yet been told that the ground has gone. Caro began with the facts. He did this without theatre, in the manner of a man who has found that facts, stated plainly, do more work than any presentation of them. He described the toxicology findings. He described the farm account entries. He described the veterinary invoice file. He described Edith's letter, which he had formally transcribed, and he read 2 sentences from it in the level voice of a man reading evidence. Lawrence listened. He sat in Edith's chair, and he listened with the attentive, controlled expression that had been his expression for 6 days. And he did not interrupt, and he did not look away, and he did not look at Dorothea, which was the most telling thing he did. When Caro finished, the room was very quiet. Clara had her hands folded in her lap and was looking at the fireplace. Neville was looking at Lawrence with an expression that was not triumph. It was something more complicated and more tired than triumph, the expression of a man who has been right about something for a long time and finds that being right is not, in the end, the thing he thought it was. Dorothea was looking out of the window at the clear October morning and the elm trees and the absence of crows. Lawrence looked at the fire. Miss Marple had been sitting in the chair near the door, in the position she had occupied for 10 days in this room and in others. The position of a woman doing nothing in particular, which was the most useful position she had ever found. She had not intended to speak. Caro had the evidence and the authority and the correct instinct for how to proceed, and she had learned long ago that proceedings of this kind belonged to the police and were not improved by the intervention of an elderly woman from St. Mary Mead. But she looked at Lawrence in his mother's chair, and she thought of the 31 months, and the milk warmer cleaned to brightness in the 5 days after the death, and the horses settled and calm in their loose boxes, and the letter that Edith had written with her failing hand with the particular intention of a woman who knows she may not have much time and chooses, therefore, to be exact. And she found that there was one thing that needed to be said, and that she was the only person in the room who could say it.
"Lawrence," she said. He looked at her. His face was composed.
His eyes were the eyes she had noted on the first morning, tired in the way that sleep does not address, tired with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been managing something for a very long time. "Your mother knew," she said, not gently, but not harshly either, simply. Not the method. She was not a medical woman. But she knew that something was happening to her beyond her illness, and she knew, I think, that it was you. She did not say so in her letter. She would not say so without certainty, because she was a precise woman, and she understood the weight of an accusation. A pause. But she knew. And what she felt about knowing, the particular quality of what it cost her to know and to continue living in this house and to look at you every day, that I cannot tell you, only that she was angry, not frightened, angry, and that the anger was not because she was dying. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. It was because it was you, and because it was for the money. The room was very still. Lawrence looked at the fire for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not a breaking, nothing so simple or so complete as a breaking, but a shift, a settling, the movement of a man who has been maintaining a specific structure for 3 years and feels it, in this moment, become unnecessary. The effort of it, released, was visible in his face for just a moment before his expression reassembled. He said nothing for a long time. Then he looked up at Caro and said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "I should like to telephone my solicitor." It was the most controlled thing Miss Marple had ever witnessed. It was also, she thought, the end of him. Not the legal end, which would take considerably longer, but the essential end, the point at which a life that has been organized around the maintenance of a particular self-conception reaches the moment when the self-conception is no longer maintainable. He would go on, in the legal sense. He would have a solicitor and a trial and a verdict and a sentence. But the Lawrence Brentwood who had carried the milk upstairs with the kindness of a devoted son, who had told himself for 31 months that this was stewardship, that it was mercy, that it was the only available option, that Lawrence had ended in this room in his mother's chair at 10:15 on a Thursday morning in late October. Caro nodded to one of the constables, who went to the hallway with Lawrence to allow the telephone call in the appropriate measure of privacy. Caro himself remained in the drawing-room with the contained expression of a man at the end of a significant piece of work. Not satisfied exactly, because Caro was not the kind of man who found satisfaction in this particular kind of ending, but resolved, which was a different thing, and in its way more durable. Clara had not moved. She was sitting with her hands folded and her gaze on the fireplace, and her expression was the expression of a woman at the conclusion of a long grief that has now been given its correct name. She did not look relieved. She looked, if anything, more tired than she had at any point in the previous 10 days, which Miss Marple understood as the tiredness that follows the setting down of a weight, when the body first comprehends what the weight has cost it. Neville stood and went to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment, and then he turned and said to no one in particular, "I need some air," and went out through the hall, and Miss Marple heard the front door open and close behind him. Dorothea had not moved from her chair. She was looking at the place where Lawrence had been sitting. His mother's chair, the good chair by the fire, the chair that was now simply empty. And her expression was the most complicated thing in the room. 24 years is a long time, and the end of a marriage, even a marriage to a man who has done what Lawrence has done, does not resolve itself into any clean emotion. It does not become simple. It becomes simply what it is. A loss that cannot be mourned in the ordinary way, overlaid on a relief that cannot be felt in the ordinary way, the whole arrangement producing something for which there is no adequate word, and which Dorothea would be working through, Miss Marple suspected, for a very long time. Miss Marple did not say anything to her. There was nothing to be said that was not either insufficient or premature. She caught Dorothea's eye once, briefly, and Dorothea looked back with the steadiness of a woman who is still standing and knows it, and that was enough. Caro spoke to Miss Marple in the hall before he left. "The solicitor will advise him not to speak," he said. "We won't get a confession." "You don't need one," Miss Marple said. "You have the toxicology and the ledger and the letter. That will be sufficient." Caro looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to associate with him. The expression of a man performing a careful internal accounting. "I was wrong," he said, "not extensively, not with self-recrimination, simply as a statement of fact, in the manner of a careful man who does not evade accurate assessments of himself." "You were working from the available evidence," Miss Marple said. "The available evidence at that point pointed in the wrong direction. That is not the same thing as being wrong." "It is rather," Caro said. "But thank you." He went out into the clear October morning and got into the Wolseley and drove away. And Miss Marple stood for a moment in the doorway of Crest Hollow and looked out at the drive and the elm trees, bare and still in the pale blue air, and the absence of crows. She took the afternoon train on Friday. Gwen walked with her to the halt along the lane, through the skeletal hedgerows, in a pale October sunshine that had decided to make a genuine effort on her last day, and had largely succeeded. They walked without urgency and without much conversation, in the way of old friends who have been through something together, and have not yet decided how to speak about it. At the gate to the platform, Gwen said, "Will you come back?" "To Thistlewick." "When it isn't, when it's simply a visit." "I think I will," Miss Marple said. "In the spring, perhaps. I should like to see those roses properly managed." Gwen smiled, briefly, and then her expression became the expression it had been wearing, on and off, for 11 days. The expression of a woman processing something she has not yet fully processed. "Do you think," she said, "that he told himself it wasn't wrong? That he convinced himself?" Miss Marple considered this. The train was audible in the distance, the sound of it coming through the still air with the flat certainty of something that is on time. "I think," she said, "that he told himself a story in which it was the least wrong available option, and that he told it with sufficient consistency over sufficient time that he largely believed it." She picked up her bag. "People are very good at that. The stories we tell about the things we have done, the extraordinary ingenuity of it." She paused. "The saddest part, I think, is not that he was wicked. It is that he was not, particularly. He was simply a man who wanted something very much, and found a way to want it that he could live with. "Is that better or worse?" Gwen asked. Miss Marple thought of Edith Brentwood, writing her letter with her failing hand, precise to the last. "I am not, I think, simply dying of old age." And she thought of Clara, and the unposted letter kept in the left-hand drawer of the writing desk, and the photograph turned away from the window, and the milk warmer cleaned to brightness in the 5 days after the death. "Neither," she said. "It is simply what it is." The train came in. Miss Marple allowed the porter to take her bag, and settled into her compartment, and looked out of the window at the platform, where Gwen was standing, with the composed expression of a woman seeing someone off and feeling it somewhat. The train moved. Thistlewick halt slid backward and away. The small waiting room, the accurate clock, the platform narrowing to a point and then gone, and then the lane, visible briefly between the hedgerows, and then the rooftops and the church tower, and the grey stone face of Crest Hollow on its slight rise, 4 windows wide, the elm trees on either side stripped bare, and against the pale blue sky above the empty trees, 7 crows rising, not startled, not fleeing, rising with the unhurried purpose of birds that have been waiting for the conclusion of something, and have now at last been released from the waiting. Miss Marple watched them until the train curved away, and they were gone. And then she opened her bag and took out her knitting, and the needles began their steady movement, and the Dorset countryside went past the window in its autumn colors, and she thought about Crest Hollow, and about the way a house holds the events that have occurred within it. The warmth and the cruelty together, indistinguishable from the outside, expressed only in the quality of the life that goes on inside. And she thought about Edith, who had known, and about Clara, who had waited, and about Dorothea, who had investigated with the thoroughness and the isolation of a woman who could not yet afford to be right. She thought about Lawrence for a while, and then she thought about something else. The train went on south through the clear October afternoon, and the knitting grew, row by steady row, and at some point between Thistlewick and the first junction, Miss Marple became, once again, simply an elderly woman on a train, returning home from a visit, with nothing particular on her mind. What remained Clara Jevons received her bequest as Edith had intended. The legal untangling of Lawrence's estate management would take, in the end, 3 years. The call arrangement was voided. The mortgaged portions of Crest Hollow's grounds were subject to a creditor's claim, and the house itself stood in a state of provisional uncertainty for longer than anyone had wished. Whether it would survive in the family's hands was a question that the autumn of 1953 had not yet answered. Neville received his adjusted share and found that it resolved nothing he had expected it to resolve. He returned to Bristol a quieter man than he had left it, which was not nothing, though it was not what he had wanted. Dorothea remained at Crest Hollow through the winter, not because she had nowhere to go, but because she had decided, with the characteristic thoroughness of a woman who investigates before she acts, that she would not be driven from a house she had managed for 22 years by the actions of a man who was no longer in it. In the spring she cut the roses back hard, as they needed, and they came through in June better than they had in years. Dr. Price continued his practice. He was quieter at the end of consultations, and he followed up on everything. Inspector Carrow closed the case the following February, when the trial concluded. He did not contact Miss Marple again, which she understood to be a form of professional respect. He sent at Christmas a card with no message, only his signature, written with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything. She kept it.